The night Colleen Moore first stepped onto a Hollywood backlot, the world was still learning how to dream in moving pictures. The air trembled with the metallic rattle of clattering cameras, the hiss of carbon arc lamps, and the faint perfume of ambition that clung to every hopeful face wandering through the maze of wooden sets. Hollywood wasn't yet a kingdom, not a throne of lights and money. It was a frontier, raw, dangerous, a shimmering mirage promising glory, but dealing fate like a crooked gambler, shuffling marked cards. Colleen arrived in this half-formed world as a small, bright spark, fragile, curious, a girl with a pair of wide, questioning eyes that caught the light in a way directors couldn't look away from. She didn't know it yet, but Hollywood saw something in her long before she understood it herself. Not innocence, not fragility, not even talent. What the studios saw was possibility. And possibility, in those days, belonged to the men who controlled the studios, the theaters, the press, and every breath an actress took once she stepped inside their silent empire. That night, Colleen's fate was sealed long before she realized the price attached to her dreams. The sun had barely set when she walked alone past the towering canvas walls of a set made to look like Paris. The wooden streets glistened with a fake sheen of rain, illuminated by a spotlight that hummed like an electric wasp. The shadows stretched long, bending and curling around her feet as though trying to warn her. Turn back. Go home. This world swallows girls like you. But Colleen kept walking. She always kept walking. Somewhere behind her, a man's voice murmured her name. Soft, almost tender. She turned, but the speaker had already vanished into the shifting maze of lights. She remembered feeling a prickle down her spine, the sense of unseen eyes watching her, a feeling that would follow her through her entire career. Fame, she would discover, wasn't a spotlight, it was a surveillance lamp. In the earliest days of the silent era, power lived in the shadows. Studio heads walked like kings through halls lined with velvet curtains, their footsteps silent, their whispers deadly. They didn't need to shout, they didn't need to threaten. A single word from them could unmake a career, erase a woman from every marquee in the country, or worse, trap her forever in contracts that turned her into a living commodity. Colleen didn't yet understand the invisible machinery humming around her, the unwritten rules, the hidden bargains, the hushed scandals scrubbed away before morning editions went to print. She was still just the girl from Michigan with a dream stitched into her heart, fragile, hopeful, unprepared for the price of becoming unforgettable. The first test of her resilience came quietly, like a shadow crossing a window at dusk. Her initial roles were small, fleeting, the kind that blinked by in a flash of feathers and soft lighting. But the camera loved her. Too much, some whispered. There was something unguarded in the way she looked into the lens, as if she were offering a confession she didn't realize she was making. Directors adored that quality. Studio executives coveted it, and Hollywood began to build her piece by piece. Frame by frame, they powdered her skin into porcelain, sculpted her hair into the soon-to-be iconic bob that would one day define an era, and placed her in roles that painted her as mischievous, modern, charming, America's first true flapper girl. But Colleen's screen persona wasn't a mirror of her inner life. It was a mask crafted by men who understood how to manufacture fantasy. The audience saw a girl filled with light. Hollywood saw a product shaped by its hands. The deeper her star rose, the darker the world around her became. Rumors drifted through the industry like cigarette smoke, thin and hard to grasp. Some said Colleen was protected by powerful men. Others said those same men owned her future. Still others whispered that the bright, laughing girl on screen had already begun to crack beneath unseen pressures, though no one could name the exact source. That was how Hollywood worked. Secrets without edges, stories without authors, truths too dangerous to speak aloud. One night, after a long day of filming, Colleen wandered off the lot and found herself on Sunset Boulevard. The street lamps flickered like tired sentinels watching over the city. She paused outside a theater showing her latest film. Her face smiled down at her from a poster, radiant, carefree, perfect. It was a strange sensation, meeting yourself as the world sees you. A stranger made of ink and imagination. Her real reflection stared back from the glass window. Tired eyes, faint shadows beneath them, a subtle tremor in her breath. Which version was she supposed to be? A sudden gust of wind pushed against her, carrying with it the scent of gasoline, dust, and orange blossoms. A mingled aroma felt like a prophecy. Beauty entwined with danger. She looked around and realized the street was nearly empty. Yet she felt watched. Followed, the sense from her first night had returned, stronger this time. Somewhere, someone was shaping her story. Colleen would later describe that period of her life as walking through a dream that gradually became a cage. Every success came with strings attached. Every new contract tightened the bars a little more. The studio controlled her public image, her schedule, her voice, even the shadows she was allowed to step into. She was beginning to learn the truth. Hollywood did not reward freedom. It rewarded compliance. But Colleen Moore was not compliant, not at her core. Beneath the delicate laugh and the sparkle in her eyes, she carried a quiet defiance. A resolve forged from childhood fantasies and the secret promise she made to herself. To control her own destiny, no matter the cost. She didn't know it yet, but this defiance would ignite battles she could never have predicted. Battles with the studios, battles with the press, battles with powerful men who were not accustomed to being refused. Her ascent had begun, so had the war for her soul. For now, the camera rolled on, capturing the girl who danced in the dark, unaware that the shadows she moved through were not empty, but filled with eyes, expectations, and dangers she had yet to face. The world did not merely watch Colleen Moore rise. They studied her, copied her, shaped themselves in her image. By the mid-1920s, the bobbed haircut she popularized had cut its way through the country like a revolution, dressed in satin. Girls lined up outside beauty parlors demanding the Colleen, unaware that their rebellion had begun in a boardroom, not a salon. Hollywood had chosen a symbol, and Colleen had awakened one morning to discover she had become it. But icons are never born. They are made, and the making always leaves bruises. Colleen was barely 25 when the studio tightened its grip. Contracts thick as Bibles appeared on her dressing table. Clauses, amendments, morality stipulations, everything calibrated to ensure the Colleen the world adored remained forever frozen in the frame they constructed. She was the modern girl, the flapper, the sprite, who danced away the harshness of the world with a smile. She was optimism in motion, the bright answer to the darkness of the jazz age. But her real self that lived in quieter rooms. Rooms where mirrors reflected truths that makeup could not erase. Each day began the same way. The soft buzz of the studio phone jolting her awake, a knock on the door from an assistant who barely met her eyes, and the clicking of heels escorting her toward a set she had never seen until that moment. The machine devoured time. Hours blurred into choreographed gestures, scenes repeated until every trace of spontaneity was wrung dry. Directors praised her precision. Executives praised her reliability. No one asked how she felt. Feeling was a luxury the studio did not have the patience for. Her co-stars adored her. The crew respected her. The press circled her like moths, drawn to a flame. But admiration is not protection. And the more beloved she became, the more invisible her true self felt. The persona was growing larger, louder, more powerful, while the woman beneath it slowly dissolved. Fame is not an elevation. Fame is a migration. You leave yourself behind to become someone the world prefers. Colleen sensed this loss most acutely on the evenings when filming ended early and she was permitted to go home before the sky turned black. She would step outside the lot gates, her breath catching at the first glimpse of real sunlight on her skin. Something about natural daylight felt undeserved, as if she were borrowing it from a world she no longer belonged to. On one such afternoon, she found herself seated at the edge of Echo Park Lake, watching ducks glide across the still surface. Children laugh in the distance. The scene felt unspoiled, untouched by the industrial pulse of Hollywood. She liked to imagine herself invisible there. Just a young woman with her thoughts. But a passing newspaper boy shattered the illusion. He stared at her for a moment too long. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "You're the flapper lady," he whispered, as if afraid saying it too loudly would conjure something supernatural. Colleen smiled, but inside a tremor of ache unfurled. Even here, even in a place that smelled of lake water and eucalyptus, she was not merely a woman. She was a silhouette projected onto the world, a character in everyone's mind. A girl who could dance forever without tiring, a girl who never knew sorrow, a girl untouched by the weight of expectations. But Colleen felt the weight constantly. It pressed hardest during production meetings. Rows of men in expensive suits sat behind polished desks, deciding her costumes, her lines, her schedule, her future. She listened, smiled, nodded. Compliance was expected, encouraged, required, but dissent simmered beneath her ribs with every passing season. A quiet rebellion forming like a bruise that would not fade. One executive in particular, a man with silver hair and a voice that dripped with false affection, made a habit of referring to her as our little investment. The words struck her like a slap masked in endearment. She remembered staring at him, swallowing the retort on her tongue. Women who spoke sharply in those rooms were replaced. Women who refused roles disappeared. Women who resisted power were erased from studio memory long before their films stopped running. Hollywood did not cancel women. Hollywood simply rewrote them out of history. Colleen sensed that threat often, especially as her career accelerated towards superstardom. Every new film increased the stakes. Every new headline tightened the leash. She could not stroll down a street without photographers emerging like phantoms from alleyways. She could not dine in public without columns speculating on her company, her body, her smile, her silence. Nothing belonged to her except her thoughts. And even those grew crowded. She began keeping a small notebook beside her bed, not for scripts, not for schedules, but for the words she could not say aloud. Fears, frustrations, dreams she knew the studio would never approve. Some nights she wrote until dawn, her handwriting growing frantic as she tried to untangle the truth of herself from the character the world insisted she play. Yet despite the suffocation, Colleen was not broken. Inside her lived a daring spark, an awareness that she was more than a product, more than a face on a poster, more than a star sculpted by studio hands. She had ideas, ambitions, a hunger for creative control few actresses dared to express aloud. She longed to choose her scripts, shape her roles, build worlds instead of merely inhabiting them. And that desire, quiet, potent, made her dangerous. Dangerous to a system that demanded obedience. dangerous to men who saw actresses as assets, dangerous to a machine that punished independence. The more she tasted success, the more she recognized its cost. And the more she recognized the cost, the more she felt the stirrings of defiance. The studio sensed it before she did. Executives exchanged glances during meetings. Gossip tightened around her like a noose. One director whispered that she was becoming too ambitious. Another hinted that her charm was fading, that the public preferred her cheerful, not challenging. They were warning her. They just didn't say it aloud. But the spark inside Colleen was not a passing flame. It was the beginning of a fire that would soon ignite a conflict unlike anything the studio had anticipated. For now, she remained the darling of the silver screen, the girl who danced with laughter, who carried the modern age on her slender shoulders. But behind her bright eyes, the first cracks had formed. And once cracks appear, the world has a way of forcing them open. The camera flashed. The applause roared. But Colleen Moore, the woman, was no longer content to live in the shadow of Colleen Moore, the myth. The battle for her independence had begun, quietly, internally, but unmistakably, and Hollywood could feel the shift. The storm did not break suddenly. It gathered slowly. One quiet compromise, one swallowed truth, one carefully veiled command at a time. By the time Colleen Moore realized, the walls were closing in. The hallway behind her had already sealed like a vault door. Hollywood's power did not roar. It whispered, and its whispers always came with a price. That price arrived in the form of a new contract, a thick, pristine document slid across a polished oak table, like a blade disguised in silk. Colleen recognized the ritual. These papers appeared every time the studio sensed opportunity. When her films soared at the box office, when the public adored her brightness, when the country mimicked her hair, her clothes, her laughter. But this contract felt different. It carried a weight that pressed against her chest even before she touched it. The room was cold, too quiet. Executives lined the walls like statues carved from shadow. Their faces gave nothing away, but Colleen felt something tightening beneath the stillness. An anticipation, a hunger, a need to capture her before she slipped beyond their grasp. Just a formality, one of them assured, though the tone betrayed a hint of impatience. We simply want to ensure your long-term future with us. Her hands did not tremble, but her pulse quickened. Long-term future meant control. It meant ownership. It meant surrender, dressed as opportunity. She scanned the pages, her mind working through the dense legal language, morality clauses that dictated how she should live, breathe, speak, scheduling clauses that bound her to weeks without rest, publicity clauses that gave the studio full authority over her image, her interviews, her silence, and buried deeper, clauses that restricted her from working with any rival studio, even in the hypothetical future. She would belong to them entirely. This is excessive, Colleen said softly, surprised at the steadiness in her voice. A lull spread through the room. Executives exchanged glances, small, sharp, calculated. They were not used to resistance, not from a young actress. Not from anyone. Excessive? One repeated with a smile too gentle to be real. My dear, you're the most valuable star we have. Naturally, there are protections to uphold. Protections for whom? Colleen wanted to ask, but she already knew the answer. The studio was not protecting her. They were protecting their investment. As she flipped another page, a sensation rippled through her, a faint tightening at the base of her spine, a whisper of danger. For months she had felt watched, monitored by eyes she could not see but sensed in dressing rooms, in corridors, in the echo of footsteps behind her when she left the lot. At first, she attributed it to fame, but fame was loud, clumsy, obvious. This presence felt different, quieter, intentional. She lifted her gaze to the men in the room. Power wore human faces, but shadows did the work. "May I take this home to review?" she asked. A pause. A long, calculated pause. "That won't be necessary," the silver-haired executive replied. "We can go through it together now." So that was the game. No time to think, no time to seek counsel, no time to refuse. Colleen smiled politely, though fire smoldered beneath her ribs. "I prefer to read things privately," she said. "It helps me focus." Focus was not what they feared. Independence was. Something shifted in the room. Conversation cooled. Posture tightened. The man's smile faltered by a fraction. So slight it might have gone unnoticed if Colleen had not learned to read the signals of power. "Of course," he said, but the softness in his tone had thinned into something brittle. She gathered the contract, slid it into her bag, and excused herself with a grace that masked the tremor running through her body. The moment she stepped into the hallway, her breath escaped in a shaky sigh. The corridor stretched long and dim, lit only by the flicker of a bulb that buzzed angrily every few seconds. As her heels clicked across the linoleum floor, she sensed movement behind her. Someone stopping when she did, resuming when she resumed. She turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. Only shadows shifted softly across the wall, like ink dissolving in water. For the first time, she felt the full gravity of what she was resisting. She wasn't fighting a single contract. She was fighting the entire system that authored it. Outside, twilight draped the studio gates in violet light. Colleen walked faster, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. She found her driver waiting with the car door open, his expression as unreadable as always. But tonight, she sensed a question lingering behind his eyes. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Words would fracture the fragile composure she was clinging to. At home, she placed the contract on her dining table. The thick stack sat like a monolith, a silent testament to the war she had entered. As she lit a small lamp, the papers glowed with a pale, ghostly hue. Beautiful, deceptive, dangerous. She read the first page again, slowly this time. The language tightened around her like a rope. She imagined signing her name at the bottom. Imagined the ink drying. Imagined the cage closing. A sudden knock jolted her upright. It was late. Too late for anyone to visit. She approached the door cautiously, pressing her ear against the wood. Silence. A deep, heavy silence that felt staged. When she opened the door, no one was there, only an envelope resting neatly on the mat. Her breath caught. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, unmarked, untraceable. "Be careful. Howard does not forgive disobedience." Her fingers trembled as she held the note. Not because she feared the warning, but because she recognized the truth in it. Hollywood didn't destroy rebellious women quickly. Hollywood destroyed them quietly, slowly, completely. She folded the note and tucked it into her notebook where her private thoughts lived. Then she sat down, took a deep breath, and began reading the contract again. Not as an actress, not as a star, but as a woman preparing for a battle she could no longer avoid. Her life was no longer a dream, but a negotiation. Her future, no longer a promise, but a threat. Her freedom, no longer assumed, but at stake. Colleen Moore, the dazzling flapper, the nation's sweetheart, was beginning to step out of the role written for her. And Hollywood, sensing the shift, began to tighten its grip. The shadow war had begun, quietly, invisibly, but decisively. By the time the ink on the contract had dried, unsigned but looming, Colleen Moore found herself moving through Hollywood like a ghost inside her own life. The industry's whispers shifted. Conversations paused as she entered rooms. Assistants met her eyes with subtle caution, as if fearing that whatever storm was gathering around her might spill outward and sweep them away. Power in Hollywood rarely announced itself. It flexed in silence, shaping behavior long before it shaped consequences. Colleen tried to continue as though nothing had changed, but everything had. She felt it in the way directors watched her, not with interest, but with evaluation. She felt it in the way studio handlers escorted her from set to set, their movements just a little too rehearsed. She felt it in the way reporters suddenly lost access to her. Interviews canceled with vague explanations. Questions she'd never answered taking shape in the margins of every newspaper column. And she felt it most keenly in the brittle, shrinking space inside herself. The porcelain persona Hollywood crafted for her, the bright flapper, the modern girl, the woman without sorrow, was growing louder than her own voice. Every day on set, she slipped into it like armor made of glass. She smiled on cue, she danced, she sparkled beneath the lights. But the more she performed the girl the world expected, the more she felt her real self dimming. It was a peculiar form of suffocation, beautiful, admired, applauded, but suffocating nonetheless. One evening, after a full day of filming, Colleen retreated to her dressing room and locked the door behind her. She removed her wig, pinning it to the mannequin's head with trembling fingers. Her reflection stared back at her, a face too composed, too polished, too untouched by the turmoil stirring beneath her skin. She whispered to the mirror, "Who am I when no one is watching?" The reflection didn't answer. It rarely did anymore. She reached for her notebook, the secret place where her truest thoughts lived. She wrote furiously, her pen carving emotion into the paper, as if she could excavate herself from beneath the persona she had become. Lines formed, jagged and breathless. "I'm disappearing. I am playing a woman the world wants, not the woman I am. If I don't choose my future soon, someone else will choose it for me." Her handwriting grew unsteady. She stopped, staring at the ink smear on the last line. She closed the notebook quickly, as though hiding her own fears from the empty room. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It wasn't the quick tap of an assistant or the familiar trio of a hairdresser. It was slower, heavier, deliberate, a sound that carried intention. She froze, the air thickening around her. "Miss Moore?" a voice murmured. "They're waiting for you." She drew a steady breath and unlocked the door. Standing in the hallway was a young man she did not recognize. A new studio messenger, perhaps. But something in his eyes unsettled her. Not malice, not admiration. Something more complex. Pity. Why pity? She followed him in silence, her heels echoing against the tile. He led her deeper into the studio complex than she'd ever ventured. Past makeup rooms, past costume departments, past offices where scripts were stamped and approved. The hallway darkened, lit only by slivers of light, bleeding from half-open doors. Finally, he stopped before a small projection room. "They're inside," he said quietly. She stepped through the door. Inside, 3 studio executives sat with arms crossed, faces illuminated by the flicker of a silent film playing on the screen. It was one of her pictures, a scene she had shot years earlier, her younger self moving with effortless joy, full of innocence, unaware of the shadows that would one day swallow that light. The projector clicked softly. The men did not turn to greet her. They didn't need to. The message was clear. They were reminding her of the girl she had been, the girl they had built, the girl they expected her to remain. "You were radiant here," one executive finally said. "America fell in love with this version of you." Colleen felt the walls pressing inward. She understood the tactic. Make her feel nostalgic for the simpler days. Make her forget her doubts. Make her remember how much she owed them. Another executive added, "We can give you more films like this. More adoration. More success." A pause. "If you cooperate." The word hung in the air like a noose. Cooperate. Yield. Comply. Be the version of yourself that we prefer. Colleen's breath trembled. She stared at the flickering image of herself, smiling, weightless, framed in soft light. That girl existed, yes, but she was incomplete. A fragment. The morning after the projection room confrontation, Hollywood awakened with its usual hum. Directors shouting across lots, studio secretaries clacking typewriters like mechanical heartbeats, messengers weaving through corridors with scripts tucked under their arms. But for Colleen Moore, the world felt altered, as if an unseen veil had been pulled over the sun. Light still fell across the sound stages, but it reached her with less warmth, filtered through something colder. She stepped out of her car and immediately sensed it. A shift, a tilt, a subtle recoil from the people who once greeted her with effortless smiles. Power, when threatened, does not roar. It reorganizes the air. Assistants now avoided eye contact. Producers offered curt nods instead of handshakes. A director she'd worked with for years walked past without acknowledging her at all. This was the first stage of Hollywood's punishment. Erasure by degrees. Colleen walked towards stage 12, script in hand, though she already knew the pages would be different from the version she had been given 2 days earlier. Scripts changed frequently, but today's revisions felt more pointed. Lines shortened, emotional beats softened, moments of nuance stripped away. It was as if someone had scrubbed her character of depth, diluting her into caricature. She approached the assistant director. "Why the changes?" He hesitated, shifting papers nervously. "The studio wants lighter material. They think audiences prefer you cheerful." The implication was deliberate. They were shrinking her, diminishing the scope of her artistry, silencing her evolution by burying her beneath the flapper image she had outgrown. "That girl isn't real anymore," Colleen whispered. The assistant nodded sympathetically, but his voice trembled when he spoke next. "Be careful saying things like that." Her stomach tightened. Everyone knew the rules. No one dared name them. Studio heads, though invisible, moved through the industry like currents, guiding, warning, shaping careers. And Colleen had stepped directly into their path. Filming began at noon. The set was deceptively bright, drenched in artificial sunlight crafted by massive arc lamps overhead. Props glimmered with forced optimism. Extras laughed on cue. Musicians flicked at their instruments, waiting for action. But beneath the fabricated cheer, Colleen felt the tension. Every gesture she made was observed, evaluated. She delivered her lines flawlessly, her timing impeccable. But the director called for retake after retake, his tone growing sharper with each pass. Again. By the 7th take, Colleen's jaw ached from holding the same smile. When the director finally signaled a break, she stepped aside, swallowing her frustration like poison. This, too, was part of the punishment. Humiliation through monotony, doubt through repetition, fatigue as a tactic. She retreated to her dressing room, forcing herself to breathe slowly. But peace eluded her. A stack of newspapers lay on the table, publications she had once graced regularly. Now, the headlines mentioned other names. Younger actresses, newer faces, starlets crafted with the same precision once given to her. Hollywood had a short memory for women who hesitated to obey. Colleen skimmed through the pages. A single article caught her eye. Is America's favorite flapper losing her spark? Her chest tightened. She didn't need to read the rest. She understood perfectly. Press manipulation. Step 2 of Hollywood's discipline. She closed the paper just as a soft knock echoed at the door. It was her makeup artist, a woman who had been with her since her earliest roles. Her eyes were kind, but clouded with worry. "Colleen, there's talk," she said gently. "The studio's unhappy. They say you're becoming difficult." The word landed like a blow. Difficult was Hollywood code for unmanageable, dangerous, replaceable. Colleen forced a breath. "I only ask for time to review the contract. That's all it takes," the makeup artist whispered. "They don't like pauses. They don't like questions." Colleen knew she was right. This town rewarded silence, and she had dared to speak. As the day dragged on, exhaustion settled into her bones. The director's tone grew curt. Crew members avoided casual conversation. Even her co-star, normally warm and jovial, barely spoke. By evening, Colleen felt hollow. She left the lot without waiting for her car and began to walk. The setting sun bleeding through hazy clouds, like a wound in the sky. Hollywood Boulevard flickered to life with neon lights, signs buzzing, street vendors calling, distant jazz drifting from a bar. But the colors felt muted, drained of vibrance. She walked until her feet ached, until the noise blurred into a muffled hum. She found herself standing in front of a familiar hotel, the one where she had stayed during her first film. The memory cut through her like a shard of glass. Back then, she had believed the city was a dream made real, that talent and hard work would be enough to secure a place in its brilliance. But dreams in Hollywood were written in invisible ink. You only saw their true meaning when the light hit them wrong. A drizzle began to fall. Soft at first, then heavier, blurring the neon into streaks of wet color. Colleen ducked beneath an awning, wrapping her coat tighter. A man passed by, glancing at her not with admiration, but recognition laced with something sharp. Curiosity, tinged with gossip. Whispers were beginning. She could feel them crawling across the city. She returned home late, her clothes damp, her mind unsettled. On her kitchen table, the contract still sat where she had left it. Next to it lay the anonymous warning note. Hauer does not forgive disobedience. She sank into a chair, her breath trembling. The room felt too quiet, the walls too close. Shadows clung to the corners like silent witnesses. She opened the contract again. Words swam before her eyes. A choice between self-preservation and self-erasure. Sign and the cage would close gently. Refuse and the cage would collapse violently. She pressed her fingertips to her temples. She thought of the little girl she once was, the one who believed in magic, who performed shows for her family in the living room, who dreamed of stories and kingdoms and freedom. Freedom. Her voice cracked as she whispered the word. Suddenly, a soft creak broke through the silence. Colleen froze. Someone was at her door, not knocking, not calling her name, just standing there. She approached slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence, deep, heavy. When she finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, but another envelope lay at her feet. This one was smaller, sealed with a wax stamp she didn't recognize. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside was a single sentence. Your next move will determine your destiny. No threat, no demand, just truth. She stood there for a long moment, the letter trembling between her fingers. Hollywood had begun its quiet assault, but Colleen Moore was beginning something too. A slow awakening, a reclaiming, a defiance that no studio had anticipated. The fall they were engineering was not her own. It was theirs. They just didn't know it yet. The days that followed unfolded like a fever dream, quiet on the surface, roiling underneath. Hollywood moved with its usual choreography, but Colleen felt the rhythm change around her, as if the entire city had shifted one step to the left. Nothing looked different, but everything felt different. Conversations grew shorter. Smiles turned brittle. People she trusted spoke to her like she was already halfway gone. Power had begun its descent, and Hollywood was waiting for her to fall. But something unexpected happened in the stillness created by that pressure. Colleen began to think, not as the flapper heroine they had built, not as the delicate porcelain girl they projected onto screens, but as the woman she was becoming. Older, wiser, wounded, but undeniably stronger. Pressure does strange things to the human spirit. For some, it crushes. For others, it forges. Colleen felt something forging inside her. One evening, after a strained day on set, she returned home and found her mind swirling with all the things she could not say aloud. The studio contract still lay on the table, as immovable as stone. The anonymous letters were tucked beneath her notebook, their warnings echoing silently. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual neon heartbeat, alive, glittering, indifferent. She opened the window and let the cool night air wash over her. Below, the streets glimmered with reflections of passing cars. The world looked almost cinematic, each movement framed by darkness, each shadow alive with meaning. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the sill, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement and orange blossoms. A sound drifted upward, a jazz melody spilling from a distant nightclub. A trumpet wailed like a wounded soul, telling its story in notes. It struck her then. Her story had never been hers to tell. Not truly, not yet. Hollywood had narrated her life, edited it, packaged it, sold it back to her in the form of headlines and roles and audience expectations. But the woman within her notebook, the woman she wrote quietly in the dark hours, was something else entirely. She closed her eyes and whispered to no one, "What happens if I take back control?" The question lingered in the room like a dare. That night, she wrote with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years, pages upon pages, ink flooding into sentences that felt alive. She wrote about the girl she once was, the woman she hoped to become, and the chasm between them that Hollywood kept widening. She wrote about power, vulnerability, autonomy. She wrote about the contract, not as a trap, but as a symbol of everything she refused to surrender. Her notebook grew heavy with revelations, and with clarity came something else. Purpose. The next morning, she made a decision, not to flee, not to surrender, but to fight for herself in the only way she could, strategically, quietly, with the intelligence Hollywood had always underestimated. She began by consulting an attorney, not one of the studio's men, but a private, discreet individual recommended by a friend outside the industry. He met her in a small cafe in Highland Park, where no one would think to look for a star. He listened, asked measured questions, and frowned deeply when she handed him the contract. "This is not a contract," he murmured, turning the pages slowly. "This is a cage wrapped in velvet." Colleen felt her breath catch. The words mirrored her own thoughts. "You can refuse," he said. "A refusal comes with consequences, severe ones." She nodded. She already knew Hollywood rarely punished men who resisted. But women were punished for even thinking of resistance. "What if," she asked carefully, "I want something different than what they want?" The attorney's gaze sharpened. "Then you must prepare for war." War. Such a small word for something so vast. They spoke for over an hour, not about scandal or revenge or spectacle, but about leverage, about timing. about the subtle moves required to outmaneuver a system designed to entrap her. By the time she left the cafe, a plan had begun to form, not a reckless one, but a deliberate path toward reclaiming her agency. But the studio sensed her shift almost immediately. Dawn came slowly. On the morning everything would change, washing the city in muted gold, as if Hollywood itself sensed a shift in the tides. The studio lots were still dark, their towering sets looming like monuments built to worship fiction. Streets stretched empty under flickering lamps, and Colleen Moore, for the first time in months, felt a strange quiet in her chest. Not the stillness of surrender, but the calm that precedes a decision long overdue. Her notebook lay open on the table, the pages gently ruffled by a warm breeze, drifting through the window. The words she had written the night before, defiant, raw, unfiltered, seemed to glow faintly in the low light. She read them once more, slowly, as though committing a spell to memory. I am not afraid of being forgotten. I am afraid of being rewritten. The thought had haunted her for years. Buried beneath the layers of persona and expectation the studio had painted over her. But now, the fear no longer held power. Recognition was not freedom. Applause was not love. And fame, especially the kind crafted by men in closed rooms, was never worth the cost of losing oneself. Colleen rose from her chair, steadying her breath. Today, she would walk into the heart of the machine that had built her and decide, finally, whether she would let it finish the job. Her driver met her with a cautious smile. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had. The studio's dissatisfaction was no longer whispered but assumed. A star in freefall always created a certain buzz, especially when that star refused to fall quietly. As the car glided through the hazy morning streets, Colleen gazed out the window. Hollywood was waking. Vendors setting up stands, actors hurrying to auditions, neon signs shutting off after a long night of flickering. Life pulsed through the city with a familiar mix of aspiration and desperation. But today, she no longer felt like part of its choreography. She felt like an observer, a woman arriving at her own story instead of someone else's script. When the car rolled to a stop in front of the studio gates, she stepped out with a confidence that startled even her. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other as if awaiting instructions not yet delivered. When they finally waved her through, she felt the shift in their silence, respect edged with caution. Inside the main building, the hallways buzzed faintly with activity. But as she walked, conversations dimmed. Assistants paused mid-step. Someone whispered her name. Someone else looked away quickly, as though fearing association. She understood. Hollywood trained people to recognize danger even before danger announced itself. Colleen stopped outside the executive conference room, the battleground where her future had been debated without her. She placed her hand on the doorknob, breathing deeply. I am not her anymore. The words gave her strength. When she entered, the room fell quiet. The same three executives sat behind the long table, their expressions a blend of annoyance, curiosity, and something colder: anticipation. They had planned for defiance. They thought they knew how to crush it. The silver-haired executive folded his hands. Miss Moore, we weren't expecting you. Yes, she replied, her voice steady. I know. They gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. You've had time to consider the contract, he said. We trust you understand what's best for your career. Colleen held his gaze with a composure that unnerved the room. I understand exactly what the contract is, and I'm not signing it. The words struck the air with the force of a slap. Silence pulsed through the room. Not shock. No, they had expected some level of resistance. But they had not expected certainty. They had not expected a woman to understand the mechanics of her own oppression. much less reject them. One executive leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension. "You realize what refusal means?" "I do," she said. "It means I walk away." The silver-haired man's eyes hardened. "And you believe you can survive that?" Colleen took a slow breath. "Survival isn't the question. Integrity is." The men shifted, unsettled. Integrity was not a currency Hollywood trafficked in. The oldest executive spoke next, his voice low and measured. "You are making a mistake that will cost you everything you've built." "No," Colleen replied softly. "I am protecting everything I am." For a moment, something flickered in the man's expression. Anger, then calculation, then a thin veil of indifference. He leaned back. "So be it." It was dismissal, but also a declaration of war. Colleen turned to leave, expecting the conversation to end there. But as she reached the door, the silver-haired executive spoke, quiet, venomous. "You were nothing when we found you." She paused, then turned slowly, eyes steady in the dim light. "And you mistook that for ownership." The room fell silent again, this time with finality. When she stepped outside, the clouds had parted, sunlight draping the studio lot in soft gold. Her steps felt lighter than they had in years. But the victory was not triumphant. It was solemn, heavy with the weight of future consequence. Hollywood did not take kindly to rebellion, and in the weeks that followed, the full force of the machine turned against her. Roles disappeared. Press coverage evaporated. Rumors bloomed like poison. The public, guided by carefully placed headlines, began to question her reliability. Her career did not collapse overnight. It eroded intentionally, meticulously, silently. But Colleen Moore did not break. Instead, she reinvented. She left the studio system. She began writing. She produced her own projects. She built worlds instead of merely appearing in them. She survived the fall that Hollywood engineered and rose beyond its reach. Years later, long after the era of silent films had faded into nostalgia, Colleen Moore spoke of that period not with bitterness, but with clarity. "They tried to make me a story they could control," she said. "So I wrote my own. In the end, Hollywood forgot many of the stars it once created." But Colleen carved her legacy not in the light, but in the shadows she walked out of. The girl who danced in the dark had become the woman who saved herself. And that, more than any film, was her masterpiece.